So we're so excited today to have Dr. Munmun De Choudhury with us. Dr. De Choudhury is an associate professor of interactive computing at Georgia Tech. She is best known for laying the foundation of a new line of research that develops computational techniques towards understanding and improving mental health outcomes through ethical analysis of social media data. And to do this work, she adopts a highly interdisciplinary approach combining social computing, machine learning, and natural language analysis with insights and theories from the social, behavioral, and health sciences. Dr. De Choudhury has been recognized with the Web Science Trust's 2022 Test of Time Award, the 2021 ACM W Rising Star Award, the 2019 Complex Systems and Society Junior Scientific Award, and numerous Best Paper and Honorable Mention Awards from ACM and AAAI, and features in coverage in popular presses like New York Times, NPR, and the BBC. Dr. De Choudhury currently serves on the board of directors for the International Society of Computational Social Science and on the steering committee of the International Conference on Web and Social Media, and the leading conference on interdisciplinary studies of social media. Earlier, Dr. De Choudhury was a postdoc at Microsoft Research and obtained her PhD in computer science from Arizona State University. So I'm happy to hand it over to her and let her get started with sharing her work with us today.
Thank you very much, Pooja, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure and honor to have a chance to speak with you today. And just a quick check. I hope everybody can see my slides and hear me okay. All right. Well, thank you. So as you can see, we have a question up on the slide. And this question is, what about social media? Does it help? Does it worsen our mental health? And I'm sure this is not the first time you're seeing that question, and you've read a lot about it, and I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts. So today, what I'm going to do is through a series of projects that we have been involved in over the past decade, we'll try to find maybe some sort of an answer. And you kind of see, a two-word answer here. Well, it depends. And the way we arrive at that answer is by taking some sort of an holistic approach. We are going to be looking at research investigations in multiple contexts, multiple platforms, populations, multiple forms of conceptualizations of mental health. All right, so with that in mind, let's get started. Before I jump into these projects, I do have a content warning. So this is, we have the word mental, we have the phrase mental health and mental well-being in the title. So there are going to be some descriptions of things like serious mental illness, self-harm, suicide, substance misuse, and so on. So I would request caution and self-care strategies to any members over here in the Zoom call who might be potentially negatively impacted. At the European Organization for Nuclear Research, also known as CERN, in 1989, we know that Sir Tim Berners-Lee came up with the idea that eventually became the web, right? So initially, Berners-Lee's innovation was actually just intended to help scientists share data across a then obscure platform called the internet, a version of which that a lot of you may have already known the US government was already using since the 1960s. But because Berners-Lee came up with the decision to release the source code of his tool for free, this came to be known as the web, and it became this open and democratic platform for all. And ever since that, we know it has taken a life of its own. From the beginning, in fact, Berners-Lee wasn't fooling himself. He understood the epic power that the web would bring to everybody, such as radically transforming governments, businesses, societies, you name it. After all, we know that web-based social platforms, particularly social media, they arguably have played a very significant role facilitating communication and interaction between, let's say, participants of political protests over the years. Protesters, for instance, have resorted to social media because they wanted to organize demonstrations. And these demonstrations have been in the past pro as well as anti-governmental. People have used these platforms to disseminate information about their activities, to raise local and global awareness of ongoing events, right? And this includes, 12 years back, the Arab Spring movement, and most recently, the Black Lives Matter movement. And then, teens today, they have grown up on the web, right? And social media has served as a space where you look at so many youth. And if I'm talking about LGBTQ youth, they in particular have found a safe space where they can go to develop and find their identities. In addition, often called a social media sensation, if you think about the Women's March of 2020, how it grew from a single Facebook post into what became a worldwide series of rallies and demonstrations, picketing, and so on throughout the world. So within short 4 weeks, because of this one post on social media, this Women's March became what is probably the largest demonstration ever convened in any country following a presidential election. But at the same time, despite all these positives, Berners-Lee also envisioned that his invention, if it went into the wrong hands, could become essentially a destroyer of worlds, as Robert Oppenheimer once infamously observed about his own creation, which was the nuclear bomb. Berners-Lee's prophecy came to life, unfortunately, where we found recently that there were Russian hackers who interfered with the 2016 presidential election in the US, or when Facebook admitted that it exposed its data on more than 80 million users to a political research firm called the Cambridge Analytica, which worked for Donald Trump's campaign. And the list goes on, right? But these benefits and harms that I just highlighted of the web were not just the concerns of its creator, Tim Berners-Lee. Many scholars over the years have observed time to time the many positives that social media and the web in general bring, whether it is helping people's well-being during major life events, helping them manage and overcome difficult experiences, giving voices to marginalized communities, or helping individuals with mental health struggles find peer support and help. But at the same time, we also see news almost every day about Instagram, Snapchat, or TikTok causing mental health problems in people, online streaming services glorifying suicide, and parents and lawmakers all the time increasingly having concerns about how to curb the damages that these platforms are bringing about in teens and young adults' mental health. Given sort of these parallel trends, we essentially have evidence on both sides of the aisle, right? But the question is, what is really the truth? Is there some sort of a final verdict after all? So this talk will delve into this question as maybe a small step forward to try to reach some sort of a verdict, although I acknowledge that we are not going to reach a verdict so quickly and easily, but hopefully a small step forward. So let's get started. So I'm going to start with the positives. That's always nice that way. And I'm going to cite some examples where we have empirical evidence of how social media has helped individuals with their struggles on mental health challenges. If you think about the deinstitutionalization movement that emerged in the late 20th century, the recovery model, it has been the guiding principle for mental health policy throughout the world. What is this model? It is a model that views recovery as essentially a personal journey rather than a set outcome, and one that involves, developing things like hope, a secure base and sense of self, supportive relationships, empowerment, social inclusion, coping skills, and meaning. So in a sense, what we are saying is recovery, if you think about recovery from mental illness, it's not just the removal of symptoms and restoration of functioning, but it also involves recovery from the stigma and the negative stereotypes that come with mental illness, unfortunately, and from the lack of opportunities and finding a way of living that is hopeful and contributing to life in a way, despite the limitations that an illness might be causing. As people increasingly use social media, the question we ask in this work is, are these platforms contributing some sort of social pathways to care among those individuals who are pursuing a path to recovery? So the first work that we look at here is a work that looks at self-disclosure. So one prominent use of social media by individuals suffering from a mental health struggle are them coming to these platforms simply to talk about their difficult experiences. It's called self-disclosure. If you think about self-disclosure online, particularly around stigmatizing conditions, in the offline context, these have been known to yield therapeutic benefits. So we know that social media are emerging as prominent platforms where people are coming to self-disclose around a variety of stigmatizing concerns. And here we are looking at mental illness. The question that we ask in this work are twofold. One of that is what kind of behavioral changes precede and follow such disclosures that happen on social media? And do the therapeutic benefits that we understand of sort of this opening up manifest in these changes on social media as well or not? So we address these questions by focusing on a large data set of disclosures of schizophrenia diagnoses that were shared by individuals on the Twitter platform. So we adopted a clinically grounded quantitative approach where we quantified behaviors before and after people made these disclosures. And we found many distinct linguistic differences that were discovered through natural language processing before and after these disclosures. So let's start with our first major finding here, which was topical coherency. So topical coherency is shown in this heat map that you see, and essentially, what it shows is the average coherency for every disclosure over a period of time. And so the vertical line that you see in the middle is when the disclosure happened. If you look at this heat map, you will see that there is a gradual increase in topical coherence for most people following the disclosure. And that is, you see darker, more intensely shaded cells on the right side of the figure. This result aligns with what we understand from the psychotherapy literature and the offline context, as well as the expressive writing paradigm, which tells us that when people self-disclose, it helps them organize and remember events in a coherent fashion because they're able to integrate their thoughts and feelings in those presentations of themselves. And that's what we are seeing in the context of social media as well. Now let's look at a few other linguistic differences. Here we have on the very left readability, which we find that after disclosure, it increases. From the literature, we know that when people reorganize and structure their traumatic memories or experiences, it helps them to develop some sort of a complex and coherent narrative. And what we find is that when people's readability of the postings that are sharing on Twitter, when that improves, it means that these individuals are showing evidence of maybe reduced sentence framing limitations after disclosure. Again, an indicator of a positive therapeutic outcome. Next, in the middle figure, we see that there's an increasing trend, again, in terms of word complexity, as measured by simply how complex and long words people use in their Twitter writings. And from prior research, we know that when people, especially those experiencing schizophrenia, they are often, unfortunately, limited in their ability to think with complexity. So the evidence of this kind of emergence of word complexity after the disclosure happens on Twitter, it tells us that there may have been a reduction of negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And finally, on the very right, you see a third linguistic change we observe, which is repeatability. And that means how much are non-unique words present in the Twitter postings of these individuals before and after the disclose on Twitter. So again, looking at the literature, we know that when individuals suffer with schizophrenia, they often have repetitive thoughts, right? And these thoughts often interfere with their ability to think. But here what we are seeing is after self-disclosure on Twitter, there is a reduction in word repeatability, likely indicative of maybe better articulation, as well as better more concrete thinking and functioning among those individuals who self-disclose. So what this tells us, taken together, is many of these things, many of these patterns in language we're observing on Twitter that follow a self-disclosure on the platform, in many ways are probably patterns that you would expect for people to gain after they have had therapeutic benefits in a different context. So this is a good thing, right? If Twitter is helping people achieve better therapeutic outcomes, this is very much indicative of a positive use of this platform. All right, so the benefits of social media, they are not just limited to creating a safe space for stigmatizing mental health disclosures, though. There are many other possible ways that social media can be appropriated and that we have found to yield positive outcomes to people. Just take the example of dedicated online communities. So many online communities we find on the web, they cater to the needs of many individuals who seek maybe anonymous or pseudonymous advice and help around their mental health struggles from other people who may have had similar experiences. This angle was explored in the second work that I highlight here. And here we were looking at the role of online social support in future risk to suicidal ideation. So we wanted to look if people receive online social support on these communities, does it reduce the risk of suicidal ideation going forward or not, as we would expect it to. To explore this, we examined publicly shared longitudinal postings and comments that were shared on a number of prominent mental health communities on the social platform Reddit. And then we identified individuals in this data who proceeded to post on a prominent Reddit suicide support forum at a later point in time. So using comments received on posts in these communities as some sort of a proxy for social support, what we did is we developed a human-machine hybrid statistical method. Our model quantified the effects of the language that was present in these comments that individuals received among those who posted on the suicide support forum at a later point in time and those who did not. After that, because this is essentially a causal question, we drew upon the causal inference for observational data, and we developed a stratified propensity score matching technique in which we identified essentially comparable subpopulations of individuals and measured the effect of online social support language as was shared through these comments on these forums. So what did we find? Not surprisingly, not all individuals posting on the Reddit mental health communities are equally likely to be influenced by support that they receive through comments there, right? And so who are the people who benefit more than others? So we found that people who benefit more from online social support, they tend to show greater social and futuristic orientation in their writing. They show better interpersonal awareness, and they show lower cognitive impairment through the language of their postings. After that, we found that linguistic attributes that are used to provide esteem or network support, they actually tend to reduce a person's risk to suicidal ideation more than other types of support. And that you can see in this chart that we have on the slide, where you see that for individuals who do not transition to talking about suicide, which is shown in red, these individuals are benefiting more from esteem and network support. But somewhat surprisingly, we also find that there are certain kinds of support which are actually not helpful. For instance, let's look at interpersonal acknowledgements, and we find that this type of support actually is not just not helpful, but can actually be counter-beneficial to prevent suicidal risk. So what these findings tell us is not only that the online commentary that happens on a lot of these communities, it has significant impacts on future mental health of people, but also it tells us that, how we can envision designing tools that can improve the kinds of support and the mechanisms of support that people do receive in these communities, so that features like esteem support and network support are really the kinds of support that are enhanced or promoted in these communities towards positive outcomes. But in general, what this tells us is that social media in this case is indeed helping people to some extent. At least some kinds of social support are having positive impacts in the lives of people. However, these are dedicated spaces for support, right? So you might be wondering that it doesn't surprise me that the support that people get there are helping, because that's the reason these communities exist in the first place. But there are all kinds of social media platforms, right? And every social media platform has its own affordances and its technical features. There are so many platforms, and a good example of that is Twitter, where if you think about the audience could be anybody. It's not just a set of sympathetic peers with similar experiences, like it was in the case of Reddit just a little while back, but it could be anybody. So in many ways, if you think about the audience in a lot of these platforms, who could potentially support a person, this is essentially what Lit calls an invisible audience. And many public social media platforms have invisible audience, and we don't quite understand if those invisible audiences have any impact on the mental health of people. So to explore this question, we looked again at people who come to Twitter to self-disclose their diagnosis of schizophrenia. And this study was based on a rich temporal analysis of over 400 people who self-disclosed about their illness and their nearly 400,000 audiences. What we did here was first we characterized and modeled the level of engagement that comes from this invisible audience over time. And we found that there is strong evidence of temporal as well as topical reciprocity in the interactions that happen between the disclosures and their audiences. That's something you would expect also in a online support community, right? So what does it mean? This kind of reciprocity means that the audience shares specific themes such as mental health resources, stigma, emotional support, and so on when they respond to the self-disclosures of these individuals. After that, we wanted to go further and see to what extent is this invisible audience helpful to people. So we operationalized the disclosure process through a measure of intimacy, and we built a time series model, particularly an autoregressive time series forecasting model. And we find that the patterns of audience engagement, just think about it in terms of, let's say, the number of mentions received by a disclosure, the themes that pop up in the writings of the audiences related to social emotional support, as well as personal or private life. We find that these types of audience engagements actually forecast the changes in the intimacy of the disclosures. So disclosures. What this tells us is that when people self-disclose and they get this acknowledgement, they get the support and reciprocity from their audiences, we see that the intimacy of those conversations increases over time. And we know that more intimate, more personal conversations tend to also have therapeutic benefits for people. So what this tells us is that it's not just these dedicated sort of specialized places on the web that are providing positive benefits to people's mental health, but even general purpose platforms where oftentimes you have these invisible audiences, they can also have positive impact on the mental health of individuals who choose to self-disclose their illnesses and who seek support and advice from these both visible and invisible audiences. So far, so good. But if you were thinking that there is no trouble in paradise and I'm only talking to you about positive things, that would be obviously incorrect. So now let's turn our attention to how social media can also end up hurting mental health. And I'll highlight two works where the same types of platforms and same types of affordances that help people in some cases with their mental health can also undermine other people's mental well-being. So let's revisit online communities, and we just discussed how these forums can be incredibly helpful in supplementing and augmenting people's communications and providing a sense of belonging. And all of these we just discussed can be positive, can be good for somebody's mental health. But unfortunately, we have plenty of other communities where these benefits are not so glaring. Just to take an example, the example of pro-eating disorder behaviors and the resulting communities that thrive on the internet. Oftentimes in the media, they're covered as the pro-ANA communities. These communities are very unique. They legitimize unusual restricted eating and excessive exercise, and they promote a normative physical appearance in a way that would encourage or promote these strategies as a lifestyle choice rather than a mental health challenge. These communities have been thriving on the internet for years, and in recent years, a lot of social media platforms came under fire for not doing anything about these communities. So in response to those criticism, about 9 years back, Instagram banned a bunch of pro-eating disorder and pro-self-harm tags on their platform. That sounds like a good idea, and maybe say that we could imagine that the negative effects of social media on mental health were only transitory. But unfortunately, the study that we conducted shows us that that is not the case. So while this was a nice intervention on Instagram's part to start with on the surface, but if we look under the hood at the very design of these platforms, we would find how ineffective these intervention policies were and how these platforms continue to be a thriving ground of arguably more extreme pro-eating disorder content. So we studied this through an examination of the emergence and subsequent adoption of lexical variant tags that appeared after certain tags were banned or moderated by Instagram back in April 2012. We didn't do a causal study here, but a temporal one. And what we found is that even with the intervention, these pro-eating disorder communities, they continue to thrive through the use of these lexically variant tags. So essentially, these are tags that read or look like the banned tags, but obviously they're crafted in a way to avoid automated detection, moderation, or banning. So our findings indicated that there was sort of like a deliberate strategy by the pro-eating disorder community to circumvent content moderation policies and to continue to organize and sustain themselves. Not just that, we found that these communities use certain kinds of lexical variants that showed increased participation and support of pro-eating disorder behavior. So if you just look at the number of likes or comments that the postings with these variant tags were getting, they were 30% and 15% more than what the original tags, the banned tags or the root tags used to get. And on top of that, we found that these tags, these variant tags, were also associated with content that expressed more toxic, self-harm, and vulnerable content. Basically, despite Instagram's moderation strategies, pro-eating disorder communities were active and thriving on these platforms, creating an environment that could be damaging to somebody's mental health. As this Wired article rightly put, maybe the banning not just didn't help, it actually made the problem worse. And this is a prime example of how, despite good intentions, platforms, because of their underlying design, are ending up hurting people and exacerbating their mental health rather than the other way around. Now, here's another example. If you think about social media sites, they're not just places we go to socialize, build communities, but also these are places where we stay connected about the world, be it small or big things around us, right? And one type of event where these platforms are particularly catering to disseminating information is around crisis. But this means crisis, if you think about them in today's digital age, they're not just affecting the direct victims, but in some ways, the varied information, particularly misleading information that circulates on social media, it may be impacting people, many more people indirectly through protracted and perpetual exposure to them. And what could be a better example of this rather than, other than the COVID-19 pandemic? What does it mean? How does this kind of exposure to our consumption of online misinformation impact our mental health? We answered this question through a large-scale observational study based on propensity score matching causal framework again. And this used 80 million Twitter postings made by nearly 80,000 Twitter users during the first year and a half of the COVID-19 pandemic. What did we find? We had some pretty alarming findings. We found that people who shared COVID-19 misinformation on Twitter, they experienced approximately 2 times the additional increase in their anxiety levels when compared with other people who did not share misinformation on COVID. Not just that, sociodemographic analysis revealed that certain particular groups, such as female Twitter users, racially minoritized individuals, and individuals with lower levels of education, they experienced disproportionately higher increases in anxiety when compared to other people who shared misinformation on COVID. So these findings quantify for the first time the harms of online misinformation as it relates to an individual's mental health. Let's check the reality. Half of US adults today get their news on social media, we know that. And with more misinformation thriving on these platforms than ever, we have a new challenge to tackle, which is, as we seek to moderate and counter misinformation, we also need to think about resources or other provisions that are important to be allocated to individuals who are particularly vulnerable to misinformation that they see on social media. So far we have seen quite a few examples, right, where social media is benefiting people, but others where, it is not. In fact, it could be damaging to somebody's mental health. So you must be wondering, what is the right answer to the question I posed earlier in the talk, right? And, now that you have seen evidence on both sides of the aisle, you're also thinking, maybe it is just very complicated. I just don't know. My head hurts. And I hear you. You won't be wrong. It is complicated because social media is good or bad for mental health. And this is not just something that varies by population, context, the platform under consideration, the type of use, and so on. But it is also complicated because even for the same person or community, this technology can have varied, sometimes opposing effect on the individual. So in the remainder of this talk, let me give you some examples of why this is so complex. The first example focuses on issues of digital health as well as digital harm that may result from social media use during management of mental illness recovery. So if we look at individuals who are diagnosed with serious mental health conditions, psychiatric hospitalizations are unfortunately common. And they serve as a major life transition because they involve clinical treatment, crisis stabilization, and they also involve loss of access to social networks and technology. So the period after psychiatric hospitalization, it involves not just management of the condition and clinical recovery, but it also means the person is now supposed to reestablish their social connections and get back to life, their vocational roles for successful reintegration into the society. Today, a lot of this is mediated by social technologies such as social media. But little do we understand about how people get back to social lives after psychiatric hospitalizations and the role that these social technologies play during this reintegration process. So to address this gap, we conducted an interview study with 19 consented US adults, of which 63% were women, and who experienced a psychiatric hospitalization related to a mood or psychotic disorder in the recent past. Here are some highlights of our findings. We found that participants' social lives after hospitalization were deeply intertwined with factors that are linked to self-management of their condition, such as stigma, inhibitions, over-reliance on others, and so on. We identified different approaches people adopted to reestablish social connections, often mediated by social media such as Facebook, immediately after discharge from the hospital. And this was because they felt some sort of a sense of urgency, obligation, and stigma to do so. Not just that, social technology platforms also mediated people's interactions after hospitalization because they provided spaces for disclosure, spaces for support, and sources of positive behavior change. A common theme that came up in the post-discharge goals of our participants was that they set for themselves that they needed to actively identify and address daily stressors in their lives as a part of their management process of their illness. And this was also important to them because they wanted to make positive behavioral changes in their lives. social media oftentimes helped people identify particularly the stressors that were unique to the online context, such as a negative person or an uncomfortable conversation that they may have had in the past online. But beyond the individual's role in managing their mental health condition outside of the hospital, we also found that other social connections, such as family members, friends, and importantly, online social connections, they together played a very important role in supporting the person's reintegration process. But outside of active interactions with people and sharing content online, participants mentioned that they also benefited from sort of like passive use of social platforms, such as just scrolling their news feeds to know what they have missed in their friends' lives while they were hospitalized, viewing videos that might be shared by celebrity disclosures of mental illness, or just passive consumption of content that would uplift their moods. But while participants drew several social benefits from these social media use, some participants in our study did feel that their use of these platforms actually hindered their path to reintegration because it introduced feelings of social comparison, it brought up negative interactions back in their lives, and they also felt that certain contexts could be emotionally triggering to their mental health symptoms. To unpack this a little further, some participants in our study said that they found that they were spending too much time online. And this was replacing the time that they would have otherwise spent on social interactions in person, which is a form of interaction that is likely to be richer and more nourishing following a devastating event like a hospitalization. Participants also said they saw other people's posts about doing well in life, and that made them feel less accomplished or bad. And we have to think about that in the backdrop of their own history of having been hospitalized. Some other people said that the information they consumed online was often stress-inducing and it triggered their mental health symptoms, which put them in the hospital in the first place. There are other people in our study who spoke about the negative effects of consuming other types of relevant information online, and they felt that all of the crisis stuff that we see online was just not helpful to them. This one person in our study who was hospitalized in 2020 said that he had to deactivate his social media account after being out of the hospital because he didn't wish to see social media postings about the California wildfires or the COVID-19 deaths that were affecting so many people. And that in turn had a negative impact on his own mental health. So here in this work, by looking at the social lives of people following a psychiatric hospitalization, what this work tells us is that people have shifting goals, priorities, and challenges, and social technologies play an intertwined role in the management of their illness. Sometimes they lead to positive outcomes, other times they lead to negative ones. What was interesting to us that despite knowing the harmful effects, only a few people actually did something about it, such as blocking someone, unfriending a person, reconfiguring their Facebook newsfeed, or deactivating their accounts. So there's a lot of opportunity for platform designers here, right? So they can better account for these negative effects and can provide users maybe more agency and control so that they can configure what information they see and not see on these platforms. Some of these could include things like controlling for how much of a specific type of content is available. So maybe not all feeds, all postings in the feed need to be about wildfires or the COVID-19 pandemic, or thinking about algorithmic marketplaces, which could provide some sort of a suite of content ranking or recommendation algorithms so that people can select the desired ones based on their life circumstances. So now turning to the second example, this work focuses on both harm and harm reduction that may follow the use of online communities that discuss stigmatizing experiences like substance misuse. And again, here we are looking at how the same platform for the same community can have both positive as well as negative impacts. So far, we talked about mental illnesses, but even if when we talk about a sister set of challenges, which is substance use recovery, social media are a great place for seeking support on these challenges as well. So if we look at conditions such as opioid misuse, there is plenty of research today that says that individuals do turn online to promote their recovery efforts. But in an unregulated and most cases less moderated space like these communities, some of these places may actually promote clinically unverified methods to ameliorate withdrawal symptoms or manage detoxification as a part of recovery. The use of such alternative treatments for substance misuse recovery, it is not new, right? We know about it, but it remains both controversial and poorly understood from a clinical perspective. And that's because there are reports that say that successful minimization of withdrawal symptoms is possible with alternative treatments, but other ones report that this is dangerous. It can lead to a different sort of physical dependence in individuals and can have dangerous side effects, such as increasing risk of overdose. So in this work, we examined how social media platforms are being used for discussions around alternative treatments in opioid misuse. For this, we applied recent advances in natural language processing, particularly lexicosemantic embeddings of postings shared on Reddit's many opioid use recovery forums. And then we applied expert human annotations on these embeddings. So in this way, in this work, we were able to get a more comprehensive view and understanding of the role of social media in managing substance use recovery. We found a variety of findings, but in the interest of time, I'm going to highlight a couple of them. So we found a known alternative treatment present in the discussions in these forums, and that is the use of kratom. So on one hand, many users in these forums had positive things to say about the use of kratom. They said that it led to successful tapering off of opioids, such as more harmful substances like heroin or fentanyl. And others said that it assisted them with managing better their withdrawal symptoms. And you can see that in the first quote up in the slide. But on the other hand, many users in these communities, they reported that they started misusing kratom, again, as a replacement for opioids during the recovery process. And you can read about that in the second quote. We note that there was even a subreddit to facilitate recovery from kratom in our data set, which indicates the struggles that many people faced from using this alternative treatment. And then yet others described in this forum their difficulties in reducing the use of kratom, and they made comparisons with other kinds of opioid withdrawal approaches, and those are highlighted in the third quote here. After that, we noticed that a trend in many of the conversations on these forums where users were creating some sort of stacks or kits where they were using a variety of different substances as a comprehensive alternative treatment towards their recovery. For instance, people said that they elaborately combined prescription drugs, illicit drugs, over-the-counter medications, vitamins, and other substances to ameliorate their withdrawal symptoms. And you can read about some of that in the first quote up in the slide. Along these lines, we found that people who described this, they were even people who not just use all these kits together, all these substances together, but they were postings about specific dosing patterns and timings of use. And there were another set of users who were talking about, combining all these substances in specific ways or all at once, because for them, this helped with their withdrawal symptoms. And you can read about that in the second quote here. So overall, what we note here is that, we know that mixing drugs is harmful. It can have unintended interaction and could amplify overdose if relapse occurs. But we see that people are coming to these platforms. Sometimes some of these mixing of drugs are replacing a less harmful drug with a more, going to a less harmful drug from a more harmful drug is having positive benefits for people. But we do know from clinical knowledge that these kinds of alternative uses can be pretty dangerous. So to summarize, in this work, we looked at several 100,000 postings that were made on the Reddit social media site around substance misuse. And we applied deep neural learning and human annotation to identify a list of alternative treatments. And what it tells us, our findings tell us that social media tends to be spaces where users report both successes as well as risks with the use of these kinds of alternative treatments in their recovery efforts. But broadly speaking, the opportunity here is not just to highlight the harms that could happen from these alternative treatments, but also think about potential harm reduction efforts in substance misuse. So for instance, we discovered that people often report dependence on alternative treatments. In some cases, interactions between these substances can be dangerous, but still, we have to acknowledge that many users are attempting to reduce the harm of dependence on opioids, even if these are approaches that are not clinically verified at the moment. Broadly speaking, these kind of behaviors represent efforts at harm reduction, and recognizing these behaviors can be an important step for us to promote maybe safer drug use, and importantly, understand the key role that social media plays in mediating these kinds of positive and negative uses of alternative treatments in substance misuse recovery. So I'll begin to wrap up here. So, hopefully through the series of studies I described today, it paints a complex picture. And that was my intention about the relationship between social media and mental health. There can't be a blanket answer of yes or no, as oftentimes we tend to read in media or in popular discourse. Hopefully, these series of studies tell us that it is actually a very complex relationship. So whether social media helps or hurts, it basically depends on a number of factors, right? As we see in these studies, and as you saw, it is not just dependent upon who uses social media, when, and for how long. Again, this is a simplistic picture we tend to read in the news media, but rather the answer to that question is through the path of investigating the how. To understand the impacts, we need to unpack and maybe think deeper about the characteristics of use of social media and look at mental well-being and mental health from different perspectives. Understanding people's needs are also going to be really important. And so it is important to understand the experiences and stages of life and circumstances based on social media use, and to understand in what circumstances social media can be helpful and in what others it can be harmful. For instance, we found the different roles that social media plays for individuals recovering from opioid misuse and those who experienced a psychiatric hospitalization, right? Importantly, if we think about platforms, we cannot just think of platforms as a monolith. Platforms or communities have norms, and these norms additionally dictate who and what forms of benefits and harm are even possible to start with, as we saw was the case for individuals looking for mental health support before they felt suicidal, or people who were looking to open up about their diagnosis of their serious mental illnesses. At the same time, we also have to recognize that the answer to this question I posed in the title of the talk today is also impacted by the design and affordances of these platforms, as was the case for the pro-eating disorder communities, or was the case for the COVID-19 misinformation on Twitter. So this gives rise to a related question, which is that we recognize this contrasting picture, but are we doing enough? Are we doing enough to amplify the good and address the bad? And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that some platforms are at least making an attempt to answer that question. To give you some examples, in response to individuals sharing suicide or self-harm content, Tumblr has been known to issue public service announcements. What do these contain? You see some examples up in the slide. These contain links to helplines and resources for mental health literacy, for raising awareness, and for fighting stigma. Facebook similarly has been developing an AI for suicide prevention, wherein they're computationally analyzing private conversations on Messenger to identify and intervene during moments of crisis. These are commendable efforts, right? But there is still a lot to do. One of the biggest risks comes from social media platforms, algorithmic recommendations, and information curation systems. A good example of that is the Facebook newsfeed. These systems, what do? They find similar content to a user's posting history or their social ties with other users. Sounds like a harmless idea. However, when these systems begin to suggest content that may promote or glorify damaging behaviors, such behavior gets reinforced to particularly vulnerable individuals. So with appropriate modification to these recommender systems, it is possible that platforms could limit the exposure of harmful content, right? Whether it is misinformation or it is unsupportive content from others who do not acknowledge struggles with suicide or struggle with eating disorders. So instead of that, what platforms could do is to introduce supportive, caring, or empathetic content in the suggested recommendation, and to also help disseminate information to aid recovery efforts among individuals. This was all about fixing all that is broken. But a complementary question could also be that how can positive stuff that is already happening, how can that be reinforced on these platforms? In other words, how can we learn from the benefits that these platforms are already offering to make it reach a much wider population? To give you an example, if self-disclosure has therapeutic gains on a person's mental health, which we saw earlier on in this talk, the question is, can we design these platforms to make disclosures easier? Probably we can think about journaling features on these platforms, or features that would enable people to self-reflect on their positive experiences on these platforms. So ultimately, there is no denying that social media sites in particular, and the web in general, has critically shaped our world today, right? And there are many outcomes we are grateful for, as the web's creator, Tim Berners-Lee, also acknowledges. But we have more work to do if we want these platforms to be a force for good. And as technologists and researchers, that onus is on us. It is not on the users of the platforms. So instead of shunning social media as a solution, which again, many individuals tend to advocate, I would say that it is our moment to define what these platforms could look like going forward, so that their proliferating and this intertwining role that we increasingly see in our lives, it is meaningful and nourishing and not strangling our mental health, as was worded by one of the participants in one of my studies in the past. That is all what I have for you today. I would like to acknowledge all my students, collaborators, and the sponsors of this work, without whom this work wouldn't be possible. And thank you very much. I think I have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. De Choudhury. If folks have questions, can you please just raise your hand in the chat, and I'll call on names so we can do this in an organized fashion. Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for coming to talk to us today. So my question is that in recent years, it seems like more clinicians have joined social media like Twitter, TikTok, Reddit. Do you think that they've started to contribute to these communities? And if so, would it be like a positive or negative impact?
Indeed, I think more and more clinicians and providers in general are acknowledging that social media in some ways has to be folded into treatment in some ways, whether it's formal treatment or informal. So I do see many positives of that, and I'll recount a couple of those positives. We talked about misinformation, and I think this is one place where clinicians can have a lot of positive role to play, because for things like substance misuse, you just saw the different kinds of dangerous alternative treatments that some people tend to use, and these people could benefit a lot from some expert advice, rather than hearing from some random person for whom some treatment may have worked, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is good for everybody. So I see that benefit. The second benefit I see is also in terms of clinicians getting a better handle of the struggles that people face and the struggles that may not come up in a one-on-one, consultation in a doctor's office, especially for therapists. We have seen in our work that knowing what happens on social media can paint a fuller picture for their own patients. And thirdly, I would notice the other benefit is simply to fight stigma. There is just so much stigma, and clinicians can have an important role to play to normalize conversations of mental health.
Oh, hello. Yeah, so we learned that the effect of social media is complicated, and they are depending on the context, they are varying from people to people. So for those people who are seeking for, like, saying, online support, so how do you address the fact that the situations they become so reliant on the social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're obliquely pointing to issues that are also commonly discussed in media, such as social media addiction. And yeah, I mean, for anybody, too much of anything can be good. The point that I'm trying to make here is that is quite the opposite, that to counter social media addiction, let's just remove social media from our lives. Let's be real here, right? That's not possible. There are people who literally grew up with these platforms. So the question rather is, yes, too much of use of anything is bad, and people might get dependent on the support that they receive online. The question is, how do we manage maybe the expectations and what is accessible from these platforms? And that maybe think about situating that in the context of other forms of help and support that people get in the offline context. So basically, how can social media be a part of the conversation and part of the process of support rather than getting rid of it completely?
Thank you.
Out for any other hands that are raised before we hit time. Thank you again for a wonderful talk. My question actually was relating to some of the last stuff that you talked about with regards to the implications for the design of a lot of these systems, because I think there's some really interesting things both from the algorithmic perspective, from the actual user interface design for those systems, the interaction, and some interesting ethical questions about, like, who has autonomy and control and who should be doing that. And so I think there's some interesting things that you talked about in terms of the algorithmic curation process of that really being maybe with those social media companies of thinking about how they do that. I was actually really curious from the interviews that you conducted with users reacclimating to social media, if anything came up with them in terms of changing needs and desires for how social media platforms presented themselves. I guess I'm curious about how they talk about wanting autonomy or control, or whether they want those social media platforms to leverage data that they know about them and about their contacts to proactively take those steps, and sort of what the most ethical path here forward is that is respectful of everyone's agency, autonomy, control, and context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important question. In fact, most of our work, we have found that people want platforms to do something, but that doing something often means giving more agency to the person. So a lot of sort of the changes in algorithms that I discussed, a part of it also needs to be that how can I curate my algorithm, right? So that I get to see what I want to see instead of having the platform decide what is good for me. So most people in our studies asked for that. In terms of social media platforms, whether they should be analyzing their data or not, we have done other studies on that topic. Again, I mean, that answer to that question is very complex. There isn't like people don't want it or everybody has no problem and they're like, go for it. I mean, the answer is really sort of in the subtleties and the nuances. We have seen that the common question that the deciding factor often is, what is going to happen after this analysis? Mm-hmm. How are they going to use it? Is it who is going to get access to those, any kind of inferences that are made? So for instance, for mental health, people with mental health challenges, they say that, yeah, if my clinician gets to see it, if my family members get to see it, that is okay. But if you share it with my employer, that is not okay. So
Right.
it kind of depends upon a lot of these complexities. So we don't see like a blanket answer on that question. But in general, yes, people do want more agency and more autonomy because they're asking these questions about who gets to see the data or use these inferences. That means they want that they get to decide on those questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Any other questions? I think we're just about at time. So thank you so much, Dr. De Choudhury, once again for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thanks for all the questions we had today, and we'll see everybody next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.